Southern society was also structured to prevent uprisings. The use of slave patrols to monitor activities of African Americans proved very effective in suppressing slave activities. Southern militias tended to be very well armed and prepared to deal with these sorts of situations. Logistically, any sort of large-scale uprising was extraordinarily difficult. That's not to say that there wasn't constant fear of this event among white society. This was one of the costs paid by white society for this institution, the perpetual fear that this would lead to an eruption of violence. If outright rebellion was not really an option, what else could African Americans in bondage do? Well, they could run away, and certainly quite a few did just that. But there were also problems with this strategy. For instance, where would they run to? The population held in slavery was increasingly concentrated in the Deep South. For people to flee from this region would require them to cover quite a lot of territory, dodging slave patrols, finding ways to feed themselves, trying to find directions. Because masters went to great lengths to isolate their slaves from information about the outside world, knowledge about how to get to the north or what it was like there was very limited. Early on, there were other alternatives. Before Florida became part of the United States, for instance, it was common for slaves from Georgia to escape across the international border into the Spanish-controlled region, where they often joined with the bands of Seminole tribe. Before settlement had filled in the South, it was similarly possible to flee west or to uninhabited regions to create isolated maroon colonies. Over time, as the U.S. expanded and the southern population filled up these isolated spaces, these options became less and less viable. For many African Americans, there was also another problem: family. If it was difficult for an individual to escape the South, it was infinitely more difficult for an entire family or a group to do so. Thus, those contemplating flight faced the harsh fact that they would probably have to leave their families behind, never to see them again. This served as a strong disincentive for people to flee. Were there any other alternatives? Clearly, if you were an African American in bondage, you couldn't realistically hope to overthrow the system through rebellion. It was extremely difficult to physically escape the system of slavery, so what was left was finding ways to live within the system that provided some space for control over your own life and human dignity. Despite being in slavery, African Americans did have some degree of power. Their masters wanted and needed one thing from them: labor. While it was very difficult to completely deny them this, it was possible to do things like working slowly or inefficiently, to break tools, to pretend not to understand instructions. Masters used corporal punishment to try and address this, but they were often also forced to provide some incentives as well, in terms of concessions on the work pace or better living conditions. In this sense, African Americans had some power, however small. It was also quite typical for masters to allow their bondsmen to define their own lives outside of work. The slave quarters were a world unto themselves, and here African Americans in bondage could create a fragile community and families. It gave them a sphere where, within severe limits, they could create their own culture and own values. Certainly, if we look at the unique contributions of African Americans to modern American society in areas such as music, it's clear that they retained and evolved a unique culture within the confines of slavery. One area where this particularly stands out is in terms of religious worldview. In the 18th century, few masters were very interested in spreading Christianity to their slaves, but in the 19th century this practice flourishes. This reflected in part an effort on the part of the masters to assuage their consciences, but they also saw it as a way to psychologically control their slaves. When white ministers preached to black slaves, they emphasized values which reinforced the system of slavery, observing, for instance, the acceptance of slavery in the Old Testament, or the idea that social inequality in the material world would be compensated for with equality in heaven. It was not uncommon, however, for these slaves to hold their own religious meetings, often in hidden locations, where the message was quite different. They pointed to events like God's liberation of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt, to suggest that Christianity did not endorse slavery, that there was hope for salvation in this world as well as the next.